Hi, I'm Wayne Tuttle, and welcome to Chasing Legends. Welcome back to Chasing Legends. Please hit subscribe, hit the notification bell. Check out our website, www.legendofsuperstitionmountains.com. Additionally, Dutch Hunter Rendezvous coming up November 3rd, 4th, and 5th. We will do a special Chasing Legends on that. So everybody has kind of the routine and the mix and everything, but there is information in our videos on previous. In fact, one of them shows you how to actually approach the camp and where to go, and does a bit of a tutorial of the camp and the sites there. We welcome everyone. There's not a special invite. The fact that you heard this or you want to come, that's your invite. Additionally, I will be making everybody aware when History's Greatest Mysteries with Lawrence Fishburne is doing the Lost Dutchman episode, and we will be doing a bit of a Chasing Legends of how that occurred to give everybody a little insight in an upcoming program. But for today, we have something different. We have something I like to call, when we occasionally do something, two sides of the coin. And sometimes people tell stories. And that's exactly what they do. They tell stories. They consider themselves authors. A lot of times, especially the internet authors, what they do is they take other people's material, they add their own little bits and pieces. They really don't do anything, and they post the stuff out there. And since a lot of people don't have the libraries or the material we have, they put that out there as like they know a lot. And people are very, oh, that's really interesting and stuff. And I run across an awful lot of stories where I'm like, that's not ever what I heard. So what happens is you have people that are kind of armchair Dutch hunters, and to a large degree, they don't really know what they're talking about, but they like to tell a story or infer or inflect themselves in. So I will tell you the story that's told, and then I will tell you the actual story and explain why I know the actual story. So this story takes place May 12th, 1973. And it says that there's a gentleman named Charles Lewing comes into Crazy Jake's camp up in Squaw, up on Peters Mesa. And when he enters that camp, there's two brothers named Jesus and Sanchez Guerrero. And they're known as real bad guys. They'd been in and out of prison. They were just really bad guys. And they threatened and intimidated and ran people out of camp. And they were hired as Jake's like watchdogs, bad guys. Well, Lewing came into camp. He'd been fired recently by Crazy Jake. He'd worked for him previously. And he came to camp and found just Sanchez there by himself. And Sanchez and him got into it, and I think they make the inference that Jesus is there too. And basically it comes to where they pull their guns. Charles Lewings has a bad firing pin, and Guerrero pulls his .45 and shoots him dead. And then after he does it, decides he's going to hide and conceal the body. It makes a reference to he takes a rope, ties it to the body, runs it over the cliff, puts it down in a crevice, and throws some rocks on it. And then Jake comes in, finds out what happened, calls the sheriffs, and the sheriff's department comes out to investigate and all this. The sheriff's reports make it sound much different than the story, but the story is basically Crazy Jake has a bunch of hired gunmen in camp. Sounds a little Piperish, Ed Piperish. And Guerrero's just a real badass. And he's good with a gun, and he gets the drop on Lewing, who has a bad revolver. And end of story. I mean, why would you go in there against a hired gunman with a .22 with a bad firing pin? Anyways, this individual also says that it happened it looked like up in upper Squaw or somewhere. He says it was near Walter Gassler's camp and all this stuff. And he knows who I'm talking about him now. The only problem with this story is I know at least a dozen guys that worked for Crazy Jake. And they come to the rendezvous and they talk around the campfire and they tell a lot of stories. And some of them I know quite well. Ron Feldman, Brian Lichtman, but I also happen to know someone that came in the day or two after this incident and knew everyone in particular in this situation. His name's Bob Shoes. And I told Bob I'd say nice things. He said, make it nice about me. Of course it would be. But Shoes had recently been talking to me. And he's telling me the story, and I'm thinking, I thought I read this, but this isn't anything like what I heard. And Bob Shoes, for a time, would bring in some guys that were looking for work to work for Crazy Jake. But Schuss mainly packed supplies in and out for him. So he'd do a lot of packing. And then him and Jake had a falling out later. And they got into a bit of a feud. Of course, Bob Schuss is still here and nothing happened to him. And most of the guys that worked in those camps said there was more the atmosphere created of the hired gunman camp than actually was there. And since most of them are alive and come into the rendezvous and stuff and talk, and none of them seem to have grudges with each other, I would think that's more the case. So here's what really went down. Now, Charles Lewing had worked for Crazy Jake. He quit and went back to Texas. I guess he'd had enough. He had a temper and all this, and then probably him and Jake weren't getting along, and Jake is the big dog and the alpha in that outfit. So Lewing had left town and all. He kept correspondence and kept up with Jake what was going on, and Jake, unlike what some people think, Jake was a con man from pretty much day one. I think Ron Feldman's talked about that before. And Jake was always conning people and making up stories about places and things that supposedly he's finding. Well, one of the things Jake did was Ladislao Sanchez Guerrero, known at most everybody knew him as Laszlo. He came in to work for Jake. He came from southern Mexico. He didn't really speak much English at all. In fact, one of the most puzzling parts about when this story was told is I had to ask a number of people. Nobody knows anything about a brother, and Laszlo was the kind of guy that would never hurt a fly. He was a very nice guy, spoke very little English, and he was basically kept the camp together, watched things in camp, and was the cook. Yeah, kind of like completely flip it around a 180 on this. So anyways, Lewing was told by Jake that, well, Laszlo had been a Jesuit priest, and he had gone through this archival stuff and knew about all these Jesuit tunnels and where this treasure was. And Laszlo had no idea Jake was telling people this, but Jake had convinced people, well, Charles Lewing, known as to everybody who worked in or in around there and known him as Chuck, thought, you know what? I'm going to go in there and I'm going to get a hold of this Laszlo guy and I'm going to make him cough up what he knows about this tunnel. So he got some friends together. They went to First Water, and Chuck Lewing basically told his friends, you guys wait here. I'm going to go into camp. This Laszlo guy there, I'm going to get it out of him, and then we're going to meet up and we're going to set up. So he'd rented a horse. They stayed at First Water, dropped him and the horse off. He rode in. He goes to meet Laszlo. So Chuck Lewing goes into camp. The camp is, nobody's in camp at the time. Now the camp also, let me remind you and make sure everybody understands, is in LaBarge. Jake had been camped up in Squaw, up top, more up on Peters Mesa, but then he moved his camp at this time, and it was down in LaBarge Canyon, back where it meets up with Squaw. It's down in the bottom down there by some big boulders and stuff, and you can still see some of the stuff there today. But that's where the camp is at this time, 1973, in spring of 1973. So Laszlo's in camp. Chuck Lewing shows up, and Lewing starts yelling at Laszlo. Now Laszlo, there's a cooking area with a little roof over it and stuff, and he's over there messing with stuff, and this guy's yelling at him, and he doesn't know what this guy wants. He thinks this guy's asking for work and stuff, and Laszlo can't speak enough English, and he's getting nervous because the guy keeps yelling at him, and Laszlo gets more and more nervous. What Charles Lewing didn't know is Jake left a .45 automatic in the kitchen area for Laszlo because he's there by himself, and it was there for his own protection against animals or something like that. But one of the problems we find out is Laszlo never really shot a gun before. So there is a problem here because Laszlo's the cook, man. Wouldn't hurt a fly. So Lewing goes and unsnaps his holster, goes to grab his gun. Laszlo at this point knows the gun's sitting there under this rag off to the side over there on the table. So he runs over, jumps over, grabs it, turns and starts shooting. He did shoot Lewing twice. He probably is lucky he got him twice because Bob Schuss even said you could see whereas he pulled the trigger each time, the gun kept rising until it was shooting into the roof. So literally he shot Lewing, maybe got him the second time, and then kept firing, and as he pulled the trigger, the gun kept raising until he's shooting into the roof, and he emptied the clip on the .45. Lewing had died. Laszlo realized this is bad, but he also knows Louis probably has friends, so he can't leave, so he doesn't know what to do. So now he's even more nervous. Who knows if he could even figure out how to load the gun, if there was spare ammo for him. So Laszlo very nervously takes and drags Louis off where the boulders are around the corner, puts him in around some boulders and puts some other rocks and stuff on him to kind of keep the animals and stuff away from the body till Jake and the rest of the crew come back. Jake comes back. Laszlo tells him this guy came in. I don't know what was going on. He's yelling at me. I was shooting at him. So Jake calls the sheriff and has the sheriff come out and says, look, Laszlo was in the camp by himself. I don't know what was going on, but this guy who hasn't been out here, doesn't work for me anymore, showed up and blah. So they couldn't get a lot out of it. Laszlo, by the way, is acquitted in self-defense because Laszlo really doesn't have an idea what's going on. There's newspaper articles and a lot of stuff like this. And I've heard Laszlo, who's Ladislao, Sanchez Guerrero's name used a lot, never have heard anyone ever mention the fictitious, obviously, brother Jesus. And nothing from everyone that I talked to confirm that, said Laszlo was pretty mellow. Well, they found out also Laszlo's illegal. He's illegally in the United States. So they basically send him back to Mexico. And you would think this is the end of the story, but Laszlo, within a year, comes back. He works for Jake a little off and on, and then a woman named Lil at a restaurant, and is around for 3 or 4 years. Nobody quite knows. Talked to knows what happened to him, figures he probably got his citizenship and went on and lived a normal life. Now, the funny thing is, when you read the story and how many people, and I've always said what gets propagated is people see it and they read it and they kind of believe in a story that had literally, it's the only parts about the story that were true was it had his name spelled wrong. It didn't have the L in it because it's Ladislao with an L at the end. And they all knew him as Laszlo. You can say that Charles Louis was just a newspaper article thing. And you don't expect everybody to know his name was Chuck. But the location, everything where the camp was, everything concerning it, and the reference to it was wrong. It's just a shame. And this is what happens so often when people say to me, well, how do you know this isn't true? Because it's a lot of times the source. And at this point, I'm not going to use the person's name, but sources have a habit of pulling material, taking some newspaper, putting some stuff in they think makes it sound better, incorporating them somehow into the time period in the area where this happened. And then what happens is it all starts to come unraveled. Now, I know the person wasn't in the area, and he can sit there and wiggle on his seat all he wants. I know where he was actually figuratively at that time. And I know the truth. But what I didn't understand is, why would you get the story so wrong and then want to tell it in a public forum where there's too many people dropping in? Bob Schuess isn't the only person that knows that story isn't true. And that is problematic. But what happens is, forums and a lot of places in the social media networks don't allow anybody to call anybody out. As soon as you say anything negative, they say, well, you're calling me a liar. And then the thread gets banished, or that person gets put, or the threads get deleted, or and then everything disappears. So you never find out the truth. What's left is the fake article story. Yes, a man named Charles Louis was killed in Crazy Jake's camp. It wasn't where it said it was. It didn't really happen the way it was. Laszlo wasn't the person that portrayed him as be. And I'm sure Laszlo, with the misspelling and everything else and the way the stories, unless maybe he learned to speak English, but it's doubtful he's going to pop up sometime and say, well, that didn't really happen like that. But that's one of the problems, and I tell people time and time again, is you go to source material or source people that were there. We still have a lot of people that were in the late 60s, early 70s, worked with Crazy Jake. And they like to sit around and quietly tell occasional stories. Why don't they tell more? Because you got people spilling stories that aren't really true and making stuff up and make it sound like they were a bunch of violent criminal ex-convicts and this and that. And they were just guys going out there for adventure, looking to make some money. And Jake was a con man right from the start. He was conning these guys into all this crazy stuff up there because he wanted good labor. And if he found a hard worker, he'd promise them the moon, wouldn't pay them, but take care of them out there. And once you're kind of stuck, you're stuck. Fortunately, some guys got better of it. And you never hear there's a good ending result. There was always a feud with Jake when someone left. And I've heard more than once someone say that once they were done with Jake and they got into it, Jake was always acting threatening and like he was going to kill someone and do this. And they said none of it ever happened. You realized after a while he was blowing total smoke and Jake would never pull anything off or do anything. In fact, and I asked today a couple people, I said, were there any other real deaths up there outside of Chuck Lewing? And they were like, nah, for the most part, it wasn't the way people portray it or see it. Even as a kid, I was told stay out of that area. It was probably because there was a large group of adults and you could get in trouble up there. But no, so there you go. Almost every facet and fact of that story that was told was absolutely bunk. But that's the story that's presented. And if you go out there, you come off like kind of a know-it-all, like, oh, you're so full of it and all this. And you keep doing that to that person, then it seems like you're bullying them. And that's not the intent and purpose. The intent and purpose is always to tell the truth. Always gives credit to your source. If you're an author or a historian, you're always accrediting people for those stories. And I always do. I drop the names. And if I'm pulling it from certain pieces of information, newspaper articles maybe are a little different. But I always say what the source material are and the books and where I got some of the material and the authors for it. Because you should always do that, because that's just an ethical reason. It's not even a respect thing. Jack Sanfelice does it. Ron Feldman does it. I know Tom Collenborn did it. Jack Carlson does it. Anyone that's going to write something, I know Jesse did it. They always complain that doing at the end of the book, putting all that stuff together and those references and giving the right credit and the footnotes is one of the biggest pains in the butt of writing a book. But if you're just on the internet trolling out there just stuff that you weren't really there for and just making up stuff, you're not really an author. You're not really a historian. And if it hurts someone's feelings, so be it. Because you know what? You kind of deserve that. Because after a while, it gets kind of old. 25, 30 years of that, it gets old. And I kind of get tired because I don't think I know everything. But certainly when I'm sitting there and going, I don't want to sit there and have to go out and do that. This was a case, it was so absolutely back-ass words. There was no reason not to sit here and tell that story, because anyone that hears it, it plays into a complete fantasy. And I had the sources and the people, and I'd heard the stories. So then that was confused me even more, is like, how did everybody else get it wrong that worked for Crazy Jake? But this individual suddenly knows the most. And he didn't put his source material, so now suddenly he'll get butthurt and want to put his sources out there or delete it or something like that. So be it. You know what? I'm sorry. I'm just doing what I think is right and justifiable for people I know and want to tell their side of the story. So there you go. I hope Bob's good with that. And everybody else is. I hope everybody enjoyed this week's episode. Catch you at the rendezvous. We got guest speakers lining up. Once I'm sure I can really confirm stuff, then we will put some stuff set up. I got 3 or 4 people that want to speak. We're trying to break it into 15, 20-minute increments for everybody and kind of have a nice moving program and a number of things to go on. But camp will probably be opening up around noon on Friday, the 3rd, and we'll be breaking camp and kind of cleaning things up Sunday morning. Usually it gets quite early because everybody gets up, it starts warming up, and everybody looks around and goes, okay, I got to get home. But anyways, everybody's welcome. Come on out. Enjoy yourselves. It doesn't matter what you've said, what you've done, who you are. Just leave your baggage at the gate. Come in peaceful. Just sit back, smiles, have a few beers with us, and enjoy the weekend. All right, so that's it for this week. So I hope everybody has a great rest of the week and enjoyed this. Hope it got your wheels turning and spinning and everything else. Everybody put a smile on it. We got another teens week coming up for us. So it'll be another hot one. You'd think we'd all be like 40 pounds lighter after this, but no. Anyways, always remember, and I've said it before, I'll say it again, I'm Wayne Tuttle, you're not, and this was Chasing Legends.